All right. Well, good morning, folks. Thank you for joining us here today on February 19th for this free webinar addressing a very serious topic and unfortunately becoming an all too common topic around church shootings. We wanted to bring this free webinar to you not only as a resource of information, but that this would serve as a blessing to your ministry to help keep your people safe and secure. And we're just glad that you carved out some time for you today to address this issue. And it's our hope and prayer that this webinar will provide some insights and some history that an event that occurred back years ago that we can draw conclusions from that will benefit us today. My name is Craig Cable. I'm going to be your host today. Just a little background on me. I'm a leader and tactical trainer for our Armed Church Security Team here at a church in Loveland. I'm also involved with the Northern Colorado Christian Security Roundtable, which is a consortium of churches all along the Northern Front Range in Wyoming that is here to help provide resources and information and intel shared between churches, just intended to help continue to serve our church, but also keep our people safe. I'm an Air Force veteran. I'm also an NRA certified pistol instructor, range safety officer, and I am a tactical trainer in tactical trauma, active shooter response, crisis intervention, and tactical communications. I also do a lot of training and around the country for group publishing, of which I am employed. And my role here is the Church Safety and Security Director. We are thrilled to have our special guest today, Mike Swihart. Mike is a retired police officer and former Army officer. We still like him even though he was Army. That's going to be a nod from my Air Force roots. But 31 years of amazing service to a variety of agencies, most of his time spent in law enforcement, a master of firearms instructor, combat pistol team member. I mean, he's just got a wealth of information. I love that he was also a police chaplain. So Mike's concurrent military career, as you can see, through the National Guard Army Reserve, totaled 35 years of service. What a great testimony to his dedication to serve. Also, his military specialties were MP, cavalry, field artillery, aviation, and weapons mass destruction and space operations. So, Mike, it is a pleasure to have you here on the webinar, and thank you for bringing all of your information and training to bear in this conversation today.
Thanks, Craig. I appreciate being invited.
You bet. Well, you're also part of an organization that you started with your amazing wife, Linda, and I'd love for you to share a little bit about Heart Rescue. Would you mind sharing a little bit of that with our listeners today?
Sure. After retiring from the police department and the military, we kind of looked at each other. My wife and I looked at each other and decided that we needed something else to do, and kind of what came to us that we needed to try and help out our brothers and sisters. So we came up with Heart Rescue. It's a ministry for police, fire, EMS, and military. We traveled around the country, going to national and local events where those work groups might show up. And we talked to folks mainly about post-critical incident issues, specifically in law enforcement regarding shootings and dealing with co-worker deaths, things like that. We're a 501c3 nonprofit, and we're available by phone anytime that folks need to talk to somebody about the stuff that's going on in their life. We basically, when we go to these events, our banner has our one-line statement. It says, "Been there, done that, still standing." We like to let people know that when you go through tough times, that you can get through those with God's help.
Amen. Amen. Well, thank you for everything you're doing through Heart Rescue, not only for our vets, but our men and women in law enforcement. A sidebar, Mike's familiar with this, is I've been in the process of joining our sheriff's office here in Northern Colorado as a reserve deputy. And boy, I had a wealth of respect for our men and women who serve, and that has just exponentially increased as I've been going through this process. So thrilled to be a part of the Larimer County Sheriff's Office. Well, throughout the webinar, we're gonna create opportunities for you to ask questions, questions of some of the content that we're gonna be sharing, questions of myself, questions of Mike. So there's a Q&A button that should be in your dashboard there. Just simply pose your question, and I have folks standing by. They'll mind those questions, and then they'll bounce them to us as the presenters, and hopefully we can get to as many of those questions today as we can. Well, Mike, August 23rd, 1992, it's a date obviously that has significant meaning to you, but a lot of people who were affected by that. Can you take us back to the events of that morning at First Free United Methodist Church there in Fort Collins, Colorado?
Yes, my wife and I were attending the second service. It was a normal day, no indication of any problems. We were standing singing the first song when a man entered the sanctuary, walked along the right side, which is the side we're sitting on. He went down toward the front where his ex-wife was sitting, and I noticed that when he got up to her, he elbowed her to try to get her to move in so he could sit down next to her. The pastor noticed that and came down and shook the man's hand and apparently asked him if they would exit the sanctuary, as he probably felt some problem was about to erupt there. So the three of them walked out the back of the sanctuary. I was off duty, obviously, and I was actually on light duty at the time. Wasn't supposed to be doing police work because I had a back injury. The pastor came back in within less than a minute and then was just on the platform for just a few seconds and headed back out again. So I leaned over to Linda and told her I was going to go see what was going on. So I walked out the back. There was a man in front of me. As we walked out the back door into the parking lot, the male suspect was yelling at his ex-wife. Some of the other men that were in the parking lot were trying to intervene in that. They started to walk away from all of us. The men were following, and at one point, the lady stopped and asked her ex-husband to leave her alone, at which time he replied he would. And as he said that, he produced a 9mm handgun from under his jacket and fired 2 shots, both of which struck her in the heart. As I saw the gun come out, I was going for my off-duty weapon with my right hand. With my left hand, I was actually pushing a parishioner out of the way so I could get a shot at the suspect. We both fired at each other at about the same time. Both of our rounds hit each other. After taking the hit, I looked. It struck me in the left hand and ended up in the right chest. I looked up at the suspect. He still had the firearm in his hand, so I raised up with one hand and fired 2 more shots, both of which struck the suspect. He then raised his handgun, fired around at me, which struck me just to the left midline in my abdomen, just at and broke off my bottom rib, punctured both sides of my stomach, my spleen, pancreas, and kidney. I fired 2 more shots, at which time the suspect fell to the ground. I immediately applied self-aid to myself by placing my hands over my wounds. I knew I had a sucking chest wound, and as an EMT, I knew that needed to be covered up pretty quickly. On the other hand, I was just trying to control the bleeding on the abdominal wound. Moved forward to check on the female status, and she appeared to be deceased. I began giving instructions to people as far as having somebody call 911 and explaining the situation that needed to be relayed to dispatch. And then I attempted to tell people what we needed to do as far as securing the crime scene. The suspect's gun was within his reach on the ground. I asked somebody to move that away, so somebody kicked it a little bit farther away from him. Unfortunately, somebody came along later on and picked it up and dropped it in a trash can. So when law enforcement arrived, they couldn't find the gun, and EMS response was withheld until they could locate the gun, which I wasn't too happy with, but that's the way it is. Short story, I was transported to the ER. My wife was my medic at the scene. She was an EMT, worked at Tudor Valley Hospital in the ER, and I went right into surgery, less than 10 minute turnaround in the ER. Suspect was transported. He died in surgery. I survived. Doctor said I shouldn't have, but here I am talking to you today. That's kind of the Reader's Digest version of what happened.
Wow. Wow. I mean, it sounded like everything happened very quickly, and just praise God that you were there. You weren't operating as a formal church security person. This is back in 1992. This is before we probably even considered church security. You just were a parishioner who happened to be there this morning and was the right person in an unfortunate and tragic situation. Had your church had conversations about potentially having you serve in a security role up until then?
No, and I had honestly never had heard of anything, like that. As far as I recall, I don't recall any discussion on church security teams. Even after I was shot, it was a number of years later when I started attending a larger church in town that the discussion actually came up of starting a medical team because we'd had several medical emergencies in the service. And during that time, I thought, well, I started looking in some of the larger mega churches where they had personal protection teams for the pastors. And our church was getting pretty big, and I mentioned it, and everybody looked at me like I was kind of crazy. And then kind of pointed at myself, and I go, oh yeah, we remember now.
Yeah, yeah.
It wasn't.
Well, a lot has happened since 19. This is, for people's perspective, this is pre-Columbine. Columbine hadn't occurred yet. But I have up on the screen, this is courtesy of one of the best places that I've found that has kind of a consolidation of incidents, church shootings, but also just lethal force incidents at churches. Is Carl Chin is. And you've had some personal experience, and it sounds like he's a friend of yours. I've never personally met Carl, but I really appreciate all that he's doing to create awareness for what's happening at the church at large around the country. And on your screen alone, you can see this is, I don't even believe this is comprehensive, but it's an accounting of church shooting incidents since 1999, and you can just see them. And there's some notable ones on here that I think you even have some background on, Mike, correct?
Correct. The New Life Church, obviously, we were living in Colorado when that occurred, and Carl Chin was actually the security manager when that occurred. One of the things to point out about that incident is they were kind of prepared for it because of the YWAM shooting that occurred earlier that morning. Unfortunately, the suspect in that waited until the uniformed law enforcement left when he decided to do his deeds there. But he was able to kill 2 and wound 3, starting in the parking lot. But once he got inside, he was met. Carl and one of his security officers, who were both armed, confronted the suspect in the hall, and one of the security guards shot him and killed him. Several others that you have on there, the Charleston, South Carolina AME church. That one was pretty much televised when it occurred due to its circumstances. That guy actually came in and sat in the Bible study during the whole Bible study, and then at the end of the thing got up and just started shooting people. Yeah. There was nobody armed there. 6 or 9 people were killed in that one, and 1 was injured. And then, of course, the First Baptist Church in Sutherland Springs, we all pretty much know about that one. 26 people killed in that, 20 more injured. The pastor's own daughter was killed in that. Nobody in the church was armed. We've heard Pastor Pomeroy speak about that particular incident, him and his wife, and they normally had people that carried concealed in the church, but none of those people were in the church service that morning.
Well, even Pastor Conroy carries. I've had an opportunity to interview him, and it was just tragic set of events. The people that were most prepared to stop that threat just simply weren't there that day. We'll talk a little bit about that later in the webinar.
Yeah, him and his wife were both out of state that day. So,
well, you can just see the breadth of tragedy that's happened over the last several decades here. That I think there was a time where it was unfathomable that that violence would creep into our houses of worship, and I think that we've reached a time now we can no longer be naive to that. I think it's our responsibility to not only take stock in what's happened, analyze those events, but try to learn lessons from what each of those. And you've talked a little bit about that, Mike. Is that in some cases what stopped a threat was a good guy with a gun or training or preparation, and those maybe that didn't have that, they were somewhat unchallenged in that. So it's our hope for today that this webinar and some of the things we're going to talk about specific to your event from 1992 can help shape, maybe inform some of your own policies, procedures, and training. That the hope would be that it would maybe put some things in place to help mitigate some future risks. Well, let's talk about that. What can we learn from the events of that day? Now, Mike, I know there's no way to have foreseen what was going to happen, and my hope for this webinar, once again, is that we can look back, debrief that chain of events, and then start to explore some of the things that we would apply to today's context. That we could say, okay, that we would maybe tackle that a little different. So let's maybe dive into that. Does that sound good to you, Mike? Let's kind of run through each one of those parts. I've identified a few things, and I'd love your thoughts on how that can be applied to today's church security context. Well,
okay, yeah. The main lesson I think is preparation. We talked about and that's what the training's all about, is to get you prepared. The training consists of being trained physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. And I tell people when I go to get to speak at these conferences is that being in the middle of a gunfight is a really bad time to be playing let's make a deal with God. So I really punctuate the spiritual side of it. And so that's kind of the part that most people tend to neglect when it comes to preparation. They're all about training with the physical part and the mental part, but the emotional and the spiritual are going to get you after the fact.
Well, yeah, that just goes on, and how do you prepare for that? Let's look at the first one here. This was a domestic situation, and I while oftentimes we perceive that active killer is just someone who's just randomly targeting the church, it's been our experience at our church, as well as many of the incidents that we had up on the screen earlier, is that there was a domestic connection. In fact, even Sutherland Springs had a domestic connection. There was a person in the church that shooter was targeting a family member of his ex-wife. So, Mike, were you aware, or is there anyone aware of potentially how volatile that situation was with this couple?
I had a little bit of involvement with this couple prior to the divorce. I probably can't talk about, but when he came into the sanctuary, I wasn't aware that he was going to show up. Obviously, wasn't aware that it was going to turn into a gunfight. This particular individual was a martial arts instructor, so he was the guy that normally fought with his hands. So, nobody, the gun was a total surprise on that day.
Do you know if the pastor was aware of, I mean, it sounded like they'd filed for divorce maybe a month or so prior to that. Had the pastor been involved in counseling this couple?
Well, I think they'd actually been going to another church prior to the divorce being final. I think the divorce had just become final within a few weeks of this event. I don't know the time frame on that, but from what I was told later, is the divorce was final. A lot of the details we found out about it after the fact were just that they were the 20/20 hindsight things, and we have to remind police officers all the time that when you're involved in a deadly force issue, that you can beat yourself up a lot over stuff that you find out later, but in reality, when the deadly force incident is occurring, you only can deal with what you have in front of you and what's going on right now.
You bet.
So we all kind of assumed that it was probably going to turn in. I mean, the pastor thought it was going to turn into something bad because he escorted him out. And when we walked outside, sure enough, that's what was going on. We just didn't know it was going to get that bad.
Yeah. Well, maybe one of the things, I know our church has implemented a policy that if the pastor has any concerns about a potential domestic situation that has any concerns of reprisal, or even where there's been threats, we've asked the pastor to inform and notify at least the heads of our security team, so we're aware of the situation. So if we see this person show up, sometimes that is motivated by a protection order, sometimes that's just there is no protection order in place, but it's more of an awareness. That way we at least have the ability to have eyes out to see a potential threat before it turns into a situation. That's something we've implemented on our security team. Would that be something you would recommend as well, Mike?
Yes, I think, in the situation here, I mean, there wasn't anybody, I call it a go-to person. So your go-to person would be most likely your security manager who would manage all that information and be in contact with guys like Carl Chin or your consortium that you're involved in. If you don't have that go-to person, then people might know something's going on, but they don't know who to call or who to tell. Just like when people see something suspicious around their home, they don't know what's called the police department or sheriff's office to let them know. So, those kind of things, when you put all that together, and then that person, the go-to person, disseminates it to other people on the team, so everybody knows what's going on, and you're not taken by total surprise. The New Life situation wasn't a total surprise, but the way it went down, some of their people had already left. So you never know. The situations are fluid, but it is important to have people. And calling it intelligence makes sound kind of weird to church people. Being in the military, I get teased all the time about my military intelligence stuff, but we need to keep track. It's not like you're trying to spy on the people in the church, but there's something obviously, red flag that somebody might cause your flock some harm. At least the security personnel and the pastor need to be aware of that. And Carl's a really good resource for those that are interested in establishing something like that, because he's really involved in that, and he can help you do that and manage that appropriately, because there is some liability when you start keeping records on people.
Yeah, no, that's a good insight. One thing, Mike, sometimes your audio fades out and then fades back in a little bit. Just want to make sure that everyone's hearing everything you're let's look at another point here, is creating distance between that couple. And boy, if you think of a domestic situation, they have a tendency to have a flashpoint, this kind of catalyst. And something that we incorporate into our training is that to help avoid a potential flashpoint would be to remove potential fuel sources, which is maybe one or separating those two individuals. Now, I recognize sometimes that's easier said than done, but at least being cognizant of the need to create some distance from these two people, because the longer they're in proximity, the more possibility that something is going to happen. Looking back in that situation, the pastor obviously recognized that there was a history. He was concerned enough that he intervened and brought them out of the church. Do you think what would have been the feasibility of at least separating them, or at least discouraging them, the two of them, from being within proximity to each other?
I think that probably was going on once they got outside. When it initially started up, obviously the pastor didn't know what was going on. He just wanted to make sure it didn't disrupt the service. The only problem you have with that kind of situation is if you can't control it verbally, then if you go hands-on with somebody, that creates all kind of issues. And use of force is something that everybody needs to be cognizant of, and that they're, again, training and your local and state law, as far as what's legal and what's not. Those things all come into play. In some cases, putting hands on somebody, in John's case, probably would have been a bad thing. And I think most people knew his capabilities. The folks that were outside dealing with him, one of them actually had been a student of his, and so I don't think anybody really wanted to get in a fight with him. And I hadn't even gotten up close enough to him to even talk to him yet. I was about 10 or 15 feet away from him when he drew his gun. And so I never had any verbal conversation with him whatsoever, except somebody said I yelled his name whenever he shot his ex-wife.
Mm. Yeah, you bring up a couple points, just understanding that force continuum, what's appropriate use of force. And I know one of the levels of use of force is just communications, tactical communications, de-escalation. Now, may or may not made a difference in this situation, but that's something that I know our team also focuses on, and we'll talk a little bit about that, is just, are there ways to potentially de-escalate something so that it doesn't continue to build momentum? But distance is one of them, but also use of words potentially to help see if we can kind of ratchet things down. Now, it sounded like he had a plan. He came with a plan in mind, and that obviously wouldn't stop every situation, but it may prevent something from escalating, if at all possible, when you can intervene.
Yeah, we think that's the case here, and some of the mass shootings that occur, the same thing. The people have a plan, and pretty much the only thing that interrupts it is the use of force in return. Mm-hmm. This incident probably 2 to 3 minutes from the time it started inside to the time last shots were fired. I was probably in the parking lot 30 seconds prior to the shots being fired. And and once the shots started being fired, there were 9 shots total in about 6 seconds is what I estimate the time to be.
Wow.
Just replaying that in my mind, it's probably a 6-second or less event once the first shot was fired.
Wow.
And
Well,
all shots were hits too. There were no misses in this shootout.
wow. You know, and so imagine that was in a parking lot. Imagine that playing out in the sanctuary, in a hallway, in a children's ministry room. It just shows how quickly that unfolds and the potential lethality of bystanders. It's quite remarkable. Let's look at another point. Oh, I'm sorry, Mike, I didn't interrupt you.
No, that's okay. We had bystanders there that I tell people it was a bad day to be late for church. But I actually could see the face of my brother's mother-in-law right along the guy's shoulder while I was shooting at him, which with tunnel vision, you don't normally see anybody else but the bad guy unless they're super close, and she was right behind him on shoot.
But you had the wherewithal to see bystanders in that frame of view.
Yes.
Oh, well, let's look at another one here. You know, oftentimes we think of security and medical as different roles and functions. In fact, I train a lot of church security teams, and it surprises me how little they actually train together. This is a situation where a security event turned into a medical event very quickly. And we often hear that term first responders, but in this situation, and as often the case in these other active shooter events, you have what's called an immediate responder, people who were there on scene, who are part of the situation or part of the event, and they're the ones who are providing medical care until first responders can arrive. I know personally, I'm a strong advocate for having security team members trained in basic first aid and the use of tourniquets. You know, we both would have experienced that in our military. Is tourniquets have been proven to save lives, and having a lot of people not only train in them but having accessible tourniquets oftentimes makes a difference. We found that the hard way in Columbine is that the protracted out events cause loss of life, and I think we've seen that. We've learned from that. So, Mike, I know your wife was involved. You sound like you administered some self-care, which made a huge difference for you. But your wife was also involved in that. Did others step in and provide medical assistance?
Yes, somebody went inside the church and they tapped Linda and said they needed her outside. And then we had several nurses that worked at Poudre Valley Hospital that were in the service. They were also asked to come outside. I don't think anybody was told what was going on. My wife wasn't aware that I had been shot until she saw me. But one of the nurses began doing CPR on the victim. The suspect was conscious, and actually the guy that I pushed out of the way to get a shot at him, he was actually on the ground dealing with him before EMS arrived.
Well, so it sounded like a lot of people jumped in, rolled up their sleeves, and did the best they could. But yeah, thinking about training those volunteers, it just adds additional layers. Don't rely on that particular service that Betty, the nurse who's always there, is going to be there. It sounded like you had some medical redundancy, which was fantastic. Let's look at
I got to give God some credit for that.
Yeah.
You know, like I said, none of it was planned and we weren't prepared for it. But my personal preparation and my wife's personal preparation prior to that event, and having me, there's a lot more to the story. That was a service I normally wasn't in. That would take time to go into that, but God knew what was about to happen, and He had the right people there at the right time.
Wow. I've heard that in other events where it just through the grace of God that someone was there, there was an alignment. So that is definitely worth noting for sure, that God was present in the midst of that. Well, once shots had been fired and you'd stopped the threat, I imagine there was just a lot of chaos, people running around, a lot of confusion. And you mentioned a little bit of the weapon being there and pushing it off to the side, and also how the lack of being able to locate that weapon. I know that's something we also deal with in law enforcement, is you stage medical away until the crime scene is secure. And if that weapon is still at large, you don't know if there's a second shooter or there's still a risk. And so there's a reluctance to release medical in the scene, which delays medical care. So is there any advice that you would have for, obviously this is now an active crime scene, there's things to control. Based on your training as a police officer, is there anything that would maybe apply to church security teams who want to consider that, about maintaining not only the safety of the scene, but the integrity of the scene?
Sure. The first priority obviously is scene safety, and a lot of times, we jump to the second priority, which is medical care, a little bit early. It happens in police shootings. Sometimes as soon as the suspect's down, the officers will approach, but if the suspect still is conscious and has access to the firearm, that can be a problem. So scene safety is the first priority, and medical care is second, and then securing the scene is your third priority. This involves not disturbing the scene and protecting the evidence from being disturbed, telling people not to pick up anything unless it's absolutely necessary for their safety or to protect it. Also keeping unnecessary people out. I mean, since there were firearms laying on the ground, there were parishioners that were still, like I said, latecomers coming to church that were walking around the parking lot. So I wanted to keep people away from there. So as I was holding the holes in my chest and abdomen, I was walking around trying to tell people what to do as long as I could talk. And it's pretty important that people remember that just because the shots are over with, there's still stuff that needs to be done. One of the important things, if you're involved in a deadly force issue with a weapon, that when law enforcement shows up, if there's no need to have your weapon displayed, you need to have it holstered, because he doesn't know you. As a matter of fact, a week ago today, 2 New York City detectives were shot at an armed robbery by uniformed officers who responded and didn't realize they were these guys. One of them died and the other one was hospitalized. So we want to prevent that. I know a lot of folks carry ID cards, but in the case where officers are responding to what they believe is an active shooter, they're going to be pretty pumped up. I just saw at some of the seminars I recently attended, there's an ID device. It's like a strap that you pull it out of a small pouch on your belt, and it says security on it or whatever. If you're a police officer, you pull it out of this little pouch and then you put it around you. You can look at it online. The website for that is www.dsmsafety.com. And DSM, it's easy to remember. It stands for Do Not Shoot Me. So dsmsafety.com. And I'm actually going to buy one for myself because I still carry a firearm when I'm in a church and actually when I'm in public settings. So if you need to have the weapon out to cover the suspect, that's one thing. But you also have the issue where you may have other bystanders who might be carrying concealed weapons and they have no idea who you are and might think you're a bad guy. So to be able to identify yourself, it may mean the difference between you being shot or at least looking down the wrong end of a barrel or not. So I highly recommend that.
No, that's great insight, Mike. And we've seen this before. When law enforcement shows up, comply. They're going to, like you said, they're going to be amped up under a lot of stress. They're going to try to discern what's happening, and they're going to be very curt, very direct with their commands, and comply. Get on the ground, drop a weapon, whatever you need to do. It's not personal. They just need to sort things out. And so anything that identifies you as a good person is a good consideration. Well, let's look here at one of our last points, and is, and you sort of exemplified that here with one of the last things you just said, was you're literally holding your body together from being shot while still managing the crime scene, while still giving people direction. That's incredible. I can't imagine having the wherewithal to do that, and it's just remarkable that you were able to maintain that level of stamina to be able to stay up and continue to manage that scene to the best of your ability. But I run into this all the time, is that church security teams often will rely on one or two people to provide that security. And as you can see, one person is no longer able to stay in the fight, then the potential shooter is unchallenged. And so having a team behind you is not only provide redundancy in security systems, but also the ability to assist in the event. Could be separating people, could be managing the scene itself, could be identifying witnesses, pulling witnesses together, all of that. So at the time, you were the only person that day that was trained and equipped to manage that challenge that we know of. Maybe someone else within the service, but God put you at that point in time to do that. So do you have what are some advantages outside of some that I've maybe already shared of having multiple security team members should a need arise?
The main advantage is number of eyes. If you're one person, it can only be one place at a time. If you have multiple entrances, which most churches have, you need somebody to be able to cover all the entrances, either to the church or to the sanctuary. So in the incidences that I talked about earlier, most of those, the one in Dangerfield, Texas, the one in Sutherland Springs, those individuals got out of the car with rifles. As a matter of fact, New Life Church, the guy got out of the car with a rifle. So if somebody's in the parking lot and you see somebody getting out of their car with a rifle, that should be a hint that you probably need to let your other security team members know, and somebody needs to be calling 911. So that's probably the most important thing. And you can't be inside and outside at the same time. Some of the other places that need to be watched, I think you probably covered in your training, are the child ministry areas. You need to have access control to that, just because of all of the domestic issues that are going on today. And then if the larger churches actually have specific protection for the pastor, because the large churches, the larger the group, the larger number of people that you might have that may have some psychological issues or some kind of beef with the church. Mm-hmm. What's interesting is the church, the Charleston, South Carolina church, they actually had the closed circuit television and saw the guy coming in the church. If you have closed circuit television, you need to have somebody monitoring that, and it has communications with your security team, which brings us to the communications thing. All of your guys need to be able to talk to each other. Having a guy outside and a guy inside that can't talk to each other immediately, there's not much time to talk. The guy in Sutherland Springs actually started firing from outside the church, firing through the walls before he got inside. So multiple people, the more the better, as long as you have good people. Bad people are liabilities, so don't take everybody that raises their hand that says, I have a concealed weapons permit. But there is strength in numbers, and I'm all about that.
Boy, I couldn't agree more, Mike. I couldn't agree more. Well, speaking of some of that training, you mentioned the importance of having the right people on the bus, that people that you can rely on. This is where we're going to talk to you a little bit about some of the resources that are available. Group created this kit. It's a training kit called the Safe and Secure Church, the Ministry Approach Training Kit. And there's a whole section dedicated in the videos. There's 10 videos as well as published resources. This resource was created in cooperation with Brotherhood Mutual Insurance Company that is about, okay, what type of person are you looking for on the team? What makes the qualities and qualifications you would want to have on your team, and then how would you train that person in de-escalation, in use of force, in scenario-based training, in keeping the children's ministry area safe, in evacuation, in active shooter threat. So this kit was Group's response to churches desiring a comprehensive suite of training resources, and developed by best practices that are used in law enforcement and different private security sectors. And so we had several experts speaking into the development of this content, everyone from SWAT team members all the way to children's ministry, youth ministry leaders, and medical people, everywhere in between. So this is a resource as you're hearing the conversation today on the webinar, and you're kind of thinking through, okay, well, what are some ways we can mitigate risk, and what are some ways we can enhance our training? This is a great resource we'd love for you to consider. You can take a look at that at group.com/security. We have some downloadable samples for you there, and when we send the recording of today's webinar, there'll be a link to that, so you can check that out. We also have some churches have asked us about training experiences, and so we do regional trainings around the country. If you go to group.com/security training, you can see some of the venues that we have up there now. This is a growing list as more churches reach out to us to host a training in their community. And if your community is chosen to be one of those host locations, we'll add that, and we'll come in and we'll bring one of our trainers. Most of our trainers are either security professionals or current or former law enforcement. And then we train in a lot of the principles that are contained within that kit. It's not a replacement to the kit by any means, because we can only do so much in one day of training, but it's a great training that's going to cover a lot of those best practices and principles. So it's just jammed with really practical insights that you can it will evolve it will help you evolve your training, but it'll also help shape some of your policies and procedures for church security. Now, you are also doing, Mike, the sheepdog seminars around the country. That's another great place to hear from Carl and yourself, and maybe share a little bit about what the sheepdog seminars are about.
Yes, the sheepdog concept is it's actually biblical. The Lord refers to his flock as sheep. Sheep are people that normally go about their daily lives and aren't too concerned about what's going on. And then the Bible talks about the wolf that will try to get in and harm the sheep. The sheepdog term comes from the dog that has the instinct to protect the flock. And not everybody has that. It's usually something I think people are born with. They're just born with this protector instinct. And a lot of those folks become police officers, firefighters, medics, or they join the military. But some people don't, but they still have that instinct in them. So that's kind of their thing. One of the things when Lieutenant Colonel Grossman, who's written extensively on deadly force issues and psychological aspects of combat, he said most people don't, when he calls the moment of truth, when you're confronted with deadly force, he said most people don't rise to the occasion, they sink to the level of their training. Mm-hmm. And that's, as a trainer, I was, after my first shooting I was involved in 1988, I was arriving at the police department with Linda sitting in the back of the car, and I told her, I said, today is payday. And she said, what do you mean? And I said, all the ammo that I shot, as a pistol team member, my department in Ohio gave me lots of ammo to shoot every month. And I shot, and bought my own. I said, all the ammo I've been shooting all these years, today was payday. I survived shooting incident that other people may not have survived. So in looking at it from the church standpoint, you have to realize that if you fail to plan, you have to have a plan. And if you fail to train and qualify your personnel that you have doing security, you're going to have a higher risk of people being injured and possibly even people being killed if there's an attack that takes place. The individuals have to realize that they're personally liable for their actions. So that if you shoot the wrong person or you don't do the right thing, there's criminal and civil liability that you're exposed to. And then the churches, if you have an organized team, you have to realize that it has to be done legally. There's some states like Florida where we are right now, you can't legally have a church security team unless they're certified as a security agency with the state. Texas had that. But Jimmy, Meeks, and Carl were able to get involved and got Texas to change that law. So you need to be aware of your local and state laws so that you don't get yourself into trouble. But having people with guns walking around your church that aren't trained is definitely a liability for the church. In our case, your best case scenario after a shootout occurs in your church is pretty grim. A lot of churches don't survive. The church that I was in at the time, I didn't survive that incident. The pastor had a nervous breakdown within a year. Another pastor came in, and the church eventually dwindled down to where it no longer exists. And it's not a one-time story. That's occurred over and over. Yeah. So it really is important to be prepared and do whatever you can. Get the right people and train them. And then if they get involved in something and they need somebody to talk to that's been there and done that, they can call Heart Rescue.
Well, thanks, Mike. I couldn't agree more on the training. That we always hope we rise to the occasion, and we don't. We fall back to our training and the investment teams make in training and qualifying, and not just in firearms training, but de-escalation, managing situations, risk assessments, risk mitigation, those are all part of it. Our only threat is not the active shooter threat. In fact, you're much more likely to encounter a domestic situation that doesn't turn deadly, but it can turn violent. And the risk that and liabilities that come with having undertrained or a lack of training and policies is an excellent point. Hopefully everyone listening today takes that to heart. And hopefully the training that's available, whether or not it's through groups training or whether or not you find a local trainer, invest in the training. It's huge, and you want to make sure that your people are prepared for any possibility, and that way they can not only survive, but that the hope would be that your church can continue beyond the event. Well, Mike, thank you for your time today.
One of the things I wanted to end up on with that
Sure.
is just talking to faith-based organizations. If you're not spiritually prepared to lose a gunfight, then you're not totally prepared. And I just want to leave people with that. There were things that occurred that were beyond my control, and even when I taught cops, and I taught a lot of cops over the years as far as using lethal force. There's a certain aspect of that event that's totally out of your control. You can be the most physically fit, best shooter on the department, and still there's some things that are out of your control. So some people like to call that luck. They tell me I'm lucky I'm still alive, and I don't go with that. I always like to say, if I got to choose between God watching out over me and luck, I'm going to take God watching out over me. So that's really important that people don't forget that. We're all about tactical training and equipment and all that stuff. But if you don't take care of the spiritual side, it's a real problem, especially in the aftermath.
Boy.
So God bless you, and thanks for inviting me, Craig. I sure appreciate being with you guys today.
Mike, thank you so much. Thank you for being willing to share your story, bless us with that story. And just that great reminder is that this is all of this is not only to serve in our churches in a way that are helping people grow in a relationship with Jesus Christ, but how do we create a safe environment where that can happen? And I really appreciate your closing comments. It's just a reminder that if God is not in and amongst the reason for this, then I'm not interested in it. I completely agree with your spiritual life is more important than any other facet there. So thank you for that reminder. Thank you all for joining us today. You're going to receive an email that's going to have a link to the recorded webinar. Mike mentioned dsmsafety.com. There'll be a link to that. There's going to be a link to the kit. There'll be a link to the training. And then we're also going to include a link to Heart Rescue. We would love for you to learn more about Mike's organization and everything they're doing there. So thank you again, Mike. Blessing on your time there in Florida. Stay warm. It's a lot warmer there than it is here in Colorado. I think you're surely enjoying missing out on this. But once again, it's a pleasure having you today.
It's 87 degrees right now.
Nice. Well, everyone, take care and God bless, and thank you again. We so appreciate all that you're doing to grow God's kingdom and keep our churches safe. Take care.